honor to have Dr. Matthew Peeples presenting to us from Arizona State University. Dr. Peeples is an archaeologist working within the Southwest United States and is studying the networks and interactions of multiple cultural groups. He is an associate professor at ASU, and he is also the director of the ASU Center for Archaeology and Society. In today's lecture, he will be discussing how archaeologists identify and study cultures in the ancient past and how Central Arizona acted as a crossroads for many different people. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Peeples.
So as Bailey said, I'm Matt Peeples. I'm an archaeologist. I work in the Southwest generally. I've been doing field work in New Mexico and the Phoenix area for a number of years. I've also worked in the Perry Mesa area here in Central Arizona, if you're familiar with that area as well. But a lot of the work that I do is focused on regional scales. Like, what is happening beyond just one little place? What's happening across the whole region, and how are different places connected to each other? And kind of what I wanted to do today is to talk a little bit about Central Arizona and how it plays a role in the broader patterns that we see across the Southwest. And Central Arizona is an interesting place. It's a really diverse place culturally in the present. And, when you ask an archaeologist to talk about the recent past, we're talking about 200, 300 to 500 years ago. That's still the recent past to us as archaeologists. But if you just think about, a place like Yavapai County in this area and just how many different people were here, how many different groups of people encountered each other in this area. You have indigenous populations like Yavapai, Apache, Hopi, Navajo in this area. You have fur traders and trappers coming to this area. You have the construction of the railroads. You have, the development of this as the territorial capital, and then eventually the U.S. government, and it was part of the Mexican government at one point as well. You have U.S. soldiers, forts, you have mining, all sorts of things. This really is a place where just like all kinds of different people would have been here for different reasons in the same environment in different points in time. And I think, when I think about the history of this place, I can't help but think about just how people from so many different backgrounds intersected specifically here in Central Arizona. And I think it's actually more so than in even other parts of Arizona. This is a really, really diverse place that had connections to many, many different people. We have some of the earliest European expeditions, encountered people in Central Arizona. We have the mining, we have the U.S. Army, the Mexican Army, we have railroads, all these different things, and on top of the indigenous populations that were already quite diverse in this area, including populations that were centered on the Colorado River to the west, and then in Central Arizona as well. And if we think of the environment, it's also an extremely diverse environment. This is the place that's kind of between the lowland environments and the upland environments. We've kind of got both here. I love, there's a few places in Arizona, like in the Bradshaw Mountains and things like that, where you can take one picture that has both pine trees and saguaros in it, and I always thought that's fascinating. It's like, it really is that transition between these different environments. But you've got, these lowland areas in the base of the plateau in like Perry Mesa, Agua Fria National Monument, if you've been there, where, you've got kind of the end of the saguaro and cactus biome, all the way up to Prescott National Forest and in the Verde Valley, where you've got, rivers and streams and major pine trees, tall pine trees. So that transition occurs kind of within this area, right? That's one of the things that's characteristic of this zone, that we've got kind of this southern Arizona biome and we've got this northern Arizona biome, and they kind of meet somewhere in the middle right here. And I think that's one of the things that always made this area special and also attractive to people for a number of different reasons. This is a place where you could have access to both lowland and upland resources at a relatively short scale. And also, I talked about being able to take a picture of a saguaro and a pine tree in the same place. And Central Arizona is also one of the only places where you can take a picture like this, which I just love. The snow-capped saguaro. It just kind of shows you, the variety of environments. And I'm not originally from Arizona. When I first moved here, my picture of Arizona as someone from the outside was like just all desert. That's essentially just what I thought of it as. Is it's like, oh, there's just the Wile E. Coyote cartoons. I think was my main source of information on that at the time. But since I've lived here now for a little over 20 years. And I've seen just like how diverse a place this really is. And I think Central Arizona kind of is that zone of transition between this northern and upland area, and that's something that kind of makes it special. And as an archaeologist, I've worked in many different places, and one of the things that always came up whenever I've worked anywhere where I'm encountering members of the public, people are coming out to visit an archaeological project or things like that, I always get this question: who were the people that lived here? Right? That's like one of the most common questions I ever get. And I think people want me to give them, the answer of like, what was the tribe or the culture or something that was present here in the past. And oftentimes, as an archaeologist that thinks a lot about all these diverse connections among different people, it's hard to answer that question, right? That's actually a really kind of deceptively difficult question to answer, because usually the answer is, well, there's lots of different people, and I think one way I kind of turn the tables on people is I'll often ask them, who are you? And if you ask someone, who to identify themselves, it's like, well, they might say, I'm an American, that's their nationality. They might say, I'm from Arizona, but originally from Minnesota, somewhere else, where's their history of movement? They might say something about, their religion, their family ties. Those are all things that make people who they are, the identities of who they are. And I think we often when we're thinking about people in the past, we tend to think that they didn't have complex notions of their own identity and who they were and who they related to and things like that. But I think the archaeological evidence we have points to the fact that they really did. I mean, I think people, especially in a place like this, it becomes obvious. Like people living in this area had connections to many, many different places. And in some aspects of their life, they emphasized one connection. In other aspects of their life, they emphasized another connection. But whenever you could sort of think about this question, like, who are you? A lot of times people will give an answer that's something like, well, I'm Greek on my mom's side and Scottish on my dad's side or something like that. And it's like, well, maybe you've never been to either of those places, but that's still like part of your identity, right? You have these connections and historic relationships to those places. And I ended up, this question of just like, who are the people that lived here and how hard it is to actually answer that question kind of occupied so much of my mental effort for a number of years that I actually wrote a whole book about this. And it's called Connected Communities: Networks, Identity, and Social Change in the Ancient Cibola World. And in that book, I was focusing on New Mexico. I was looking at the Zuni area in particular, and I was thinking about, through time, how someone might answer that question is really variable. There was actually a lot of people from a lot of different places that came together that ultimately are ancestral to the Zuni population today. But it's not really a simple one-to-one, right? It's not like these people are those people. You can't really make those kinds of connections in the past. It's often a lot more complicated than that. And there's a lot of different players involved in that. And I think, people that are interested in archaeology often have, read kind of basic textbooks and things like that often refer to archaeological cultures. So what is an archaeological culture? It's just an area that archaeologists have defined on a map where people are essentially living in a similar way. This isn't the same thing as a culture. This isn't the same thing as like a tribe or something like that in the past. You've probably heard these terms, Ancestral Pueblo or Anasazi, Mogollon, Hohokam. So those are names that archaeologists use to denote regions of the Southwest where people are generally living in similar ways. Maybe they're building similar houses, maybe they're making similar pottery and things like that. But what these things aren't, these aren't places, we don't think, where everybody would have spoken the same language or even thought of themselves as the same people. So you can think of today, for example, everything that we group within Ancestral Pueblo, this whole area, this whole portion of the southern Colorado Plateau here. And if you think about Pueblo communities today, you have Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, all the New Mexico Pueblos. There's 7 different languages at least spoken at contact in that area. So it was a really diverse group of people who saw themselves as distinct from one another. What they had in common was some aspects of their architecture, right? That was really one of the primary things that sort of connected them together, some aspects of their agriculture. So when archaeologists are talking about an archaeological culture, it's about stuff. It's about the things people leave behind, because that's what we as archaeologists study. And I think, we need to sort of be careful about drawing circles on maps around these things, because it kind of creates a situation where people think, oh, that's definitely the ancient territory of this group. The archaeologists say this is the ancient territory of this group or that, and we think of it as being comparable to like a nation or like a country today. And it's really something quite different. I think I wouldn't think of archaeological cultures as being something like nation states, but maybe like, a general distinction between Eastern and Western Europe. You can kind of like, in your head, maybe think of, some commonalities and differences between those different areas, although people speak many different languages across those different zones, and they have different histories that are tied together in some places and distinct in others. That's more what we're talking about when we're talking about archaeological cultures. And the 3 big ones in the Southwest that everybody sort of hears the most about is Ancestral Pueblo, or Anasazi, Mogollon, Hohokam. There's also sort of lesser known, lesser discussed areas like Patayan out west along the Colorado River and into the Great Basin, Trincheras in northern Sonora, Casas Grandes in the northern Chihuahua area, and then Sinawa here in Central Arizona is another term that you'll hear. And a lot of these characteristics of these different regions were defined in the early history of archaeology. So a lot of these were defined in sort of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And our ideas about how groups form and how people express identities have changed a lot in the last 100+ years. So I think in some ways we need to sort of reconsider this. And I'm fond of saying that archaeologists like drawing circles on maps almost as much as politicians. They like to sort of define their boundaries of different groups and things like that. It happens all over the world. Some of the things you'll notice is, especially in sort of Europe, for example, where European archaeologists are defining boundaries around ancient cultures, they're remarkably similar to modern nation states. And I don't think that's necessarily an accident, because people often do have, nationalistic ties to their own sort of the archaeology of a given region. It's often done by people from a given nation, and archaeology on the other side of the border is done by other people. So I think we have to keep in mind that, some of this is maybe denoting patterns of similarity and difference that have some reality on the ground, and some of this is where people are working, right? I think that the division between the U.S. and Mexican border is a good example of this. Hohokam, that little bubble, just barely touches the edge of Mexico, but there's actually a lot of archaeology in northern Mexico that's very much within the same tradition. I think it's sort of just like there's different people doing the work on either side of the border, and that's tended to be where the boundary is drawn. Because of basically the modern realities of archaeological fieldwork rather than anything that's sort of a reality on the ground, I would say. But we've got different examples of archaeological cultures here, and one of the things you'll notice is that even when archaeologists are drawing these sort of boundaries, there's a lot of fuzziness here. There's overlapping circles, things that are not exactly crisp. These are not nation-state borders. These are sort of general bounded areas where people may interact and things like that. So I think even if we're trying to define something relatively solid, archaeologists tend to sort of fuzz the edges a little bit, because I think we understand, that there is a lot of variability across anything that we want to explain like that. And again, as archaeologists, we deal with people's stuff, the things they leave behind, the material culture, as we call it. So the broken bits of pottery, the evidence of their agriculture, evidence of houses and things like that. So if we just wanted to look at the three main cultures in the Southwest, Hohokam, Mogollon, Ancestral Pueblo, what are some distinctions we could make? So Hohokam is in the Sonoran Desert, known for irrigation farming. There's some hunting and gathering as well. They made this beautiful red on buff pottery. I'll show you some pictures. Plain brownware pottery as well. They lived in pit houses and compounds, low density villages. The style of pottery that they made was something called paddle and anvil pottery. I'll talk a little bit about that. That was also referenced in that newspaper article, if some of you saw that as well. We've got the Mogollon region, which is essentially the mountains of Arizona, as well as some of the basin and range of southwestern New Mexico. Folks there are farming in valleys. They're generally relying a little bit more on hunting than people in other areas. They're making different pottery, redware, brownware pottery, living in compact little villages in pueblos and pit houses. Then we've got the Ancestral Pueblo up on the Colorado Plateau and the Rio Grande. These folks are heavily relying on farming. Most of it's rain-fed farming, though. We have some hunting and gathering. They're making whiteware and grayware pottery, so kind of a distinct pottery in this coil and scrape tradition, which I'll talk about. And pit houses, pueblos, and compact villages. So there's some similarities and some differences, right? But like the way archaeologists in the early 20th century would define cultures by creating these trait lists, essentially. These are the traits of this culture. Wherever you see this, we should apply this cultural category. And you can think about how people's stuff relates to who they are and who they relate to and things like that. I found thinking about this as an archaeologist, I just think of material culture because that's what I often deal with. And I found two interesting art projects that were done independently by two artists in two different parts of the world, where they essentially just photographed people with everything they own. And this is just, so Sana Kvist was doing this in Norway, and Huang Qingjian was doing this in China. And they were taking pictures of essentially people with all of their belongings, just like everything they have. And you can kind of see, the two images that were both from Norway. There's some differences, but there's also some overlap you can see there. And then the two pictures in China, there's some differences and overlap. There's also a few things that are present in both, right? Some of the technology and things like that, some of the radios and media players and things like that are kind of found across this entire area. But I just think about this is that, when we're looking at archaeological remains, we're kind of often looking at something like that, right? This is essentially like an inventory of the stuff people made and used, and that is an indication of who they interacted with, who were there, who were the people that they interacted with most frequently, how did they relate to those people, like what did they consider to be important in general. So I think it is fair to sort of make some observations about how people saw themselves using the material culture that people left behind. But I think it's often, when we rely on things like archaeological cultures, it seems too simple. It's essentially just not recognizing all the variability that could be present in this area. So if the really cut and dry distinction between early ancestral Pueblo, Mogollon, and Hohokam is shown here. We have houses in the ancestral Pueblo region where you typically have an antechamber or room kind of out front that would be used for storage, and then a separate habitation room with some space in between that is used for ventilation and so on. So that's one style of house. In the Mogollon region, you typically have these deep pit houses that are supported by posts up from the floor, and part of the wall itself is the wall of dirt that's dug down into the ground, so it's sort of plastered in that way. And you can see that example there, along with an example of Mogollon pottery, versus the Hohokam region, central to the Sonoran Desert there, where people are also building houses by digging a pit and then using sticks and plaster to sort of build up from that. But the pit itself is actually quite shallow, and the walls of the structure are built up rather than the walls of dirt being the side of the structure. And some people refer to pit houses in the ancestral Pueblo region, pit houses in the Mogollon region, but they often refer to the Hohokam version of this as a house in a pit. So it's not a deep structure that has walls made of mud. What it is it's sticks and mud coming up from a shallow pit. So it's a little bit different in this area, and you can kind of see some of the differences between the pottery styles and things like that. But when we start to look at any one place, you'll see a mixture of these traits, right? You'll see people that are doing multiple things together, and you'll see houses that have the entryway setup of a Mogollon pit house that's typical, but be in the shape and construction form of a Hohokam pit house, for example, or other sorts of combinations of these things. So like when we ever start digging into this, especially in places like Central Arizona, which are kind of in between these major traditions, we see a lot of variability in these traits. Other things that we as archaeologists like to look at is we like to look at the way people make material culture. So not just like what they make, but the way they make it. And we can often study this by doing detailed analyses of the broken bits we have. So for example, in ceramics, we can look at the cross sections of broken bits of pottery and see what sorts of things were added to clay to make the paste that's then used to make the pottery. We can also tell, what style did they use to form the vessel. Anyone here a potter? Anyone ever make pottery? You all probably, at least when you were back in kindergarten or something like that, do you ever remember coiling up a snake of pottery and sort of making a pot like that? So you were all engaged in something that's called coil and scrape pottery production. That's a really common method where you essentially make a coil of clay, spiral it up, and then use something like a piece of leather or maybe a piece of another piece of broken pottery to smooth the sides. That's a typical way that people make pottery in many parts of the world. It was also typical of the Colorado Plateau and the Mogollon Mountains through most of the history of these regions. That was the way people would make pottery in the northern half of the Southwest. They would make pottery by coiling a coil, spiraling it up, and then smoothing the coils after that, while the ceramic is still a little bit hard. In the Sonoran Desert, going all the way back to the earliest history of pottery in this region, people did things a different way. They had a different way of getting the same product. So what they would do is they would get slabs of clay and they would sort of put them together in chunks and sections and do something called paddle and anvil pottery. So you can see this image right here of the stone anvil. So this is a little object you'd hold in one hand with a stone, and you'd have a wooden paddle and you would pat the sides of the vessel to flatten them so that you get a flat vessel that you can sort of shape. And the end product is the same, right? It's a jar that's, could be about the same shape and things like that, but the way you got there is different. And we can look archaeologically at examples that we see, and we can identify, which one of these methods was used. And there's a few different ways we can do this. If you have enough of a vessel, you can sometimes see the dimples in the surface of a vessel that's been made using a paddle and anvil. It will kind of create dimples. But we've also, at Arizona State University, we've worked with some folks in medical, that have medical imaging equipment to actually x-ray some ceramic vessels. And it's actually possible to see the coils in coil and scrape vessels, even though they've been smooth with an x-ray. And you can actually see in paddle and anvil pottery, it will often create the situation where there'll be kind of star-shaped bursts of cracks around pieces of broken rock that were in the pottery clay. So we can actually use techniques like that to identify whether something was made paddle and anvil, or coil and scrape. And like I said, coil and scrape pottery was the dominant way that people made pottery on the Colorado Plateau and the Mogollon Mountains for 2,000 plus years in this area. And pottery, paddle and anvil method was the dominant way that people made pottery in the Sonoran Desert, the southern Southwest, for thousands of years. And actually still to this day, Peeples potters, many of them are still using paddle and anvil potters in the southern Southwest, and Autumn potters, and Pueblo potters are offering doing this coil and scrape tradition. So this is a tradition that has stuck around for a very, very long time. And this is something that we as archaeologists notice that this tends to be the case, right? Other things being equal, people tend to produce everyday objects, especially, using the technologies and methods that they initially learn. You usually continue to do what you initially learned to do. And people can make technologically similar pottery, likely learned in similar contexts. So they're probably learning from the same groups of people, for example. And this may suggest frequent interaction or historical connections. So where we see this sphere of paddle and anvil pottery and where we see the sphere of coil and scrape pottery, those are two artistic traditions with long histories that represent learning traditions that co-occurred across a long period of time. And so in some situations in the Southwest, all of a sudden we have, for example, in the late history of the Southwest, there's a major migration from the Four Corners into southern Arizona, among other places. And one of the things we see is all of a sudden, people are making pottery using local materials, but they're making coil and scrape pottery, which is a northern style, but they're making it in the South. So it ends up looking a lot like the pottery of the South because it's made with the same clays and materials, but it's made in the way people from the North had made pottery for thousands of years. And that's sort of one of the ways we can identify migration and things like that. In central Arizona is kind of a great example of thinking of the mixing of these traditions, because this is a place where, I'm talking about what the dominant patterns are in the Sonoran Desert, the dominant patterns in the Colorado Plateau. Central Arizona is one of those places where there wasn't really always a dominant pattern. There's a lot of things happening at various points in time. So for example, these are a couple of examples of villages dating from about 400 to 1000 AD here in central Arizona. One is in the Verde Valley, and one is in the Tonto Basin, just to give you an idea of this. But they have pit houses that are roughly similar to those in the Phoenix Basin for the Hohokam pit houses, pit houses that would be typical of that region. We also have in the site of the Verde Valley a little bit of influence, it seems, from Mogollon-style structures, a little bit deeper structures are sometimes being built in that same village. Maybe even two houses within the same cluster might have different styles of construction, which is really interesting. They're also making pottery in this area in addition to importing it from other places. And the pottery that's interesting, in central Arizona at this time, there's examples of things like coconino red on buff, which is very similar to the Hohokam red on buff pottery being made in the Phoenix Basin, but it has slight differences in design. It's being made in a paddle and anvil method. It's got red paint on a whitish slip, but they're not using the same corpus of design elements, for example. They're painting different sorts of geometric elements on those vessels. So it's almost the same, but a little bit different. That's kind of a key point for central Arizona. It's almost the same, but a little bit different. People are just doing things slightly differently here than we see them in other places. The bowl in the middle there, I guess you don't see my pointer. This bowl right here is something called Prescott Black on Gray. So this is from this area as well. And that's something that's actually relatively unique. It has sort of a distinctive design style that's distinctive to that tradition, but it's also sort of got technological similarities to other pottery being produced further to the south, for example. So what we're seeing in central Arizona at this time is sort of a mixing of these traditions, right? We don't really clearly see this is a Mogollon site, this is a Hohokam site, these things. What we're seeing is there's a mixture of things happening, even sometimes within the same household. And one example that I often think about in my own area that I worked in previously, the Cibola region, is that the big difference there is that, the thing that you first learn when you're first learning Southwestern archaeology is that Pueblo people make grayware pottery, Mogollon people make brownware pottery. That's this big distinction between these two. And one of my favorite photos that I ever took, I was working in the petrified forest area, and we encountered a grayware jar that was using a brownware bowl as a lid. And I was just like, okay. So who are the people that lived here, right? I mean, how do you answer that question when the kinds of materials that we're attributing to these cultural groups are mixed in that way? That's essentially what we often find. And I think this is a map that was produced for some recent work focused on central Arizona. And I want to compare, this map here, the complexities that are shown here versus that default map of the large culture areas that we see. And what you see here is like even more variability, right? So Prescott is kind of within the edge of what the Hohokam sphere as they're defining it here, but also in the edge of that Sinawa sphere, that northern Sinawa sphere. And certainly later in time, the southern Sinawa sphere would also sort of encompass areas right around here as well. We also have something called the Central Arizona tradition, which is not used by all archaeologists, but that's an even more specific designation. It's used for certain areas kind of in the eastern portion of Central Arizona. We have Mogollon, Western Pueblo, Mogollon, moving into the mountains, and kind of you can see all the overlap between this. And I think this is a recent map, and unlike the older maps where we're drawing relatively discrete boundaries, this is what the mind of an archaeologist in 2025 looks like, right? You know, we're all thinking about all these different overlapping things. And I think really we've become more interested in that complexity rather than sort of ignoring the complexity to sort of simplify things. We're interested in why is this a place where there's so much variability versus why is this a place where there's not, right? Why is it relatively easy to talk about Hohokam archaeology in the Phoenix area without really getting into all these things about diversity? Why is it so hard to talk about who's residing in Central Arizona? Why are those places different? And of course, many of you are familiar with the other areas and famous sites around these area attributed to northern southern Sinawa cultures often. So Tuzigut, Montezuma as well, Eldon Pueblo up in the Flagstaff area. These are all sort of Pueblo buildings, right? These are structures that are built in the style of Pueblos. They would not be out of place as a building on the Hopi Mesas or in the Four Corners, things like that. They look very similar to what you see there. Yet, if we look at the material culture that people are making in these areas, they're making, for example, paddled and anvil pottery. They're making southern style pottery, but living in these buildings that very much show connections to the north, right? So it's a really sort of interesting connection. And one of my favorite places in this region is Perry Mesa. How many people have ever been to Perry Mesa, the Agua Fria National Monument? I'd recommend you head down there at some point if you ever have a chance. It's just right off the I-17, just a little bit. It's basically right where you sort of level off if you're coming out of Phoenix, near Black Canyon City, in those areas there. And one of the reasons that I like that area so much is because it's really like the most mixed place in the Southwest to me. It's like we get southern pottery from the Phoenix area, we get northern pottery from the Hopi Mesas, we get people producing southern style pottery and people living in Pueblos, we get pit houses and structures in Hohokam style, all on that one mesa. People living there contemporaneously, all at the same time. And we also have, if you look at the petroglyphs and rock art of that area, there's rock art that's typically associated with Pueblo groups, and even, for example, some symbols that are specifically have been related to Hopi clan symbols to this day, for example. And we also have rock art that's associated with the long-term tradition in the Sonoran Desert. We also have rock art associated with the Batayan to the west and Yavapai, for example. So there's it's just one of those places where there's an enormous amount of diversity in the connections that we see. But one of the things that, when we start to dig into this a little bit more, that I find interesting is that diversity is also sort of a function of time. And it's not like these places had connections to everywhere all at once. It's often like they had connections to one place and then another place and then another place and then another place. It's kind of cycling through time. So for example, this is paddle and anvil pottery that's frequently made in the Sinawa region, Central Arizona, right here. This is some examples of what that looks like. And they're also importing painted pottery from many different places. And what they're importing changes across time and space. So for example, this black and white pottery is some of the earliest pottery that will be imported into this area from outside. So this is pottery that's typically made in the Kanta region, northern Arizona, closer to Hopi, on the Navajo reservation today, in that area. And this is the earliest kind of tradition that enters this area. A little bit later, we start to get some polychrome ceramics that come from those same places, still to the north, showing these connections to the north. Eventually, we're getting yellowware pottery. And one of the things that's really interesting about yellowware pottery, if you ever find a yellow sherd with kind of brownish black paint, you can be confident that that was made in and around the Hopi Mesas, either Hopi Mesa or Antelope Mesa today. Because this pottery is actually made with the same clay and slip and everything as this pottery here, but it's fired using coal. And that coal firing at that very, very high temperature creates this yellow color. And also the interior of this is almost like a porcelain. It's a very, very fine material. And one of the things that archaeologists that spend a lot of time looking at pottery and typing pottery and things like that, we have all these different tricks we use. But to identify if something was fired at a hard temperature, there's this trick that sometimes people use. They call it clinkers and clunkers. So if something was fired at a very high temperature and you drop it on a table, it'll make this high-pitched tick, like sound like that. And if you drop something on the table that was fired at a low temperature, it'll thud. So it's the clinker, then the clunker. And that's actually, it's about firing temperature. That's really what's controlling that differences between that. And the Hopi pottery is kind of the classic clinker, if you will. This is sort of highly fine, refined earthenware pottery that's fired at this very high temperature. But because the resources used to make that and fire that are limited to the Hopi area, wherever we find that, we know that that's where it came from. And we've sourced this chemically all over the Southwest. Hopi pottery shows up in Catalina Island, California to Iowa. It's actually quite widespread. It's been found in many, many different places, and it's always sourced back to the mesas today. So whenever you find this, suggests that the people living in central Arizona had particularly strong connections to Hopi in that area in the past. Then we've got this down here. This is something we call Roosevelt redware pottery, Salado polychrome pottery. This is kind of a southern tradition that's associated with the Mogollon Mountains in the south. So this is a southern tradition. And this shows up in areas around Perry Mesa. This shows up into areas south of Fossil Creek, if you know where that is, kind of in this area. But it's very, very rare in the Verde Valley, for example. So I find that fascinating. There seems to be some line somewhere around Fossil Creek in the Verde Valley where if you're north of that line, you're mostly interacting with people up at Hopi. If you're south of that line, you're mostly interacting with people down south in Phoenix. So there's some kind of line, a dividing line between that, and where that is changes a little bit through time. But that's kind of an interesting pattern there as well. And we can also, so looking at portable material culture is interesting, but we can also look at buildings. And the Southwest is kind of famous for having lots of different kinds of public architecture, as we call this. These are buildings that are built not by one family, not by one household, but by large groups of people, usually for public purposes. And the main kinds that we have in the Southwest are ball courts. I'll talk a little bit more about that today. We've got great houses. Who's been to Chaco Canyon? Anybody ever been to Chaco Canyon? That's another place. Put that on your list if you haven't been there. That's a beautiful place. These are just massively overbuilt constructions. They're pueblos that are built with very, very fine masonry. They're multiple stories, sometimes as much as 5 stories tall, just massive constructions. We've got great kivas of various forms, which are semi-subterranean buildings that are associated with contemporary Pueblo kivas, which are ritual spaces that are still being used to this day. We've got open, what are often called oversized unroofed kivas. They have some similarities, but some differences to the roofed kivas. Then we've got platform mounds, which are massive mounds of earth that are built up in these cells that then create platforms where other buildings are placed on top of them. These are all things that we see across the Southwest. And if you look at the map here, you can see essentially all those different things. And central Arizona is like the one place where they all kind of overlap, right? It's the one place where we see all these things, the only place where those traditions kind of intersect. And so I want to say just a little bit about each of these traditions and sort of how they relate to this area in time and in space in general. So ball court villages are something that have a long history. In the Phoenix area, there's about 192 ball courts in Arizona of this style. Which are the Hohokam style, as they're called, which is essentially 2 berms and a somewhat oval shape structure there. You can see what this one looks like from above, and then right there, you see the 2 berms of the ball court in that site. So these aerial images are kind of often how we can see them a little bit better from the air than from the ground, especially when they're covered in vegetation these days in general. So why do we refer to this as a ball court? We have some evidence, and some of this is by ethnographic analogy with other parts of the world. But throughout Mesoamerica into the Southwest, there is the widespread distribution of a ball game that has different rules in different places, probably. Like places like in Copan, Honduras, you have these really, really formal stone-lined ball courts that will often have, rings and things like that. But in other parts of Western Mexico, we have different versions of the game depicted in things like this figurine here. We have a bunch of spectators along the outside, players on the court, and you can see the players have padding on their hips and their knees and their lower body, suggesting that this is a game they're playing with the lower body. There's markers shown on those fields that show they will often have 3 markers that are shown there. And based on that, there's a modern ball game still played in Nayarit, Mexico, among other places, where people are playing a very similar game that has a similar court and layout, where essentially people are trying to get the ball from one end to the other into a goal using only their lower body, essentially, in this area. And that's something that was, observed at contact, and people are still doing this today. We have these figurines, for example, showing people, hitting a ball with their lower body, and you can see those 3 markers there. So there's been excavated Hohokam ball courts that have clusters of stone at those same locations, right? It suggests that they had a system of markers as well. We don't know the exact rules of this ball game, and we actually expect that it was different in different times and places through time. And in addition to that, there's been a small number of balls actually recovered. So they're made of a natural rubber. So this is not rubber tree rubber. This is something made from a plant called Waiuli plant that grows in sort of the northern Sonoran desert and things like that. It's a natural rubber. But this isn't your, kind of full of air ball that you can easily bounce off your hip. This is a solid rubber ball that would hurt quite a bit if you hit it. And I think that hence why we see, the players often have the kind of armoring things around their hips and things like that in general. But we find these courts all over the Hohokam region, especially before about 1075 AD. That's about when we stopped seeing them so much in the southern Southwest. And you can see, an artist depiction of what this may have looked like, some players on the field with people on the outside standing on the berms. One of the things that we know is during the time period when these ball courts were active, people were exchanging pottery broadly across all of these communities that had ball courts. So for example, pottery produced in the same places is found at all of the ball court communities. So that suggests maybe they're having marketplaces and things like that are associated with games. There was probably some regular schedule of how they sort of organized these activities in general. But something happened in about the late 11th century where people stopped building ball courts, making new ball courts. There's a few that are even stopped midway through their construction in 1075. And all of a sudden, there's actually already some up here in the central Arizona, but there's actually more built after that period up here in central Arizona in this area. And does anybody else know like a big thing that happened in north central Arizona around that time? Sunset Crater. Big explosion of a mountain, and things like that. I've always thought that, I don't know how far I want to take that interpretation, but it's like, people have this long-standing tradition that's tied to, society and ritual and all these things. A mountain explodes and then everybody changes what they're doing, in a relatively short period of time. It's kind of interesting to speculate on that as well. But central Arizona, there's a lot of ball courts up here, and I'll show you a picture of one in a minute that actually post-date when they were common in the Hohokam world, but they're in a similar form to what we see in that area. Platform mounds, again, platform mounds are really, really common in the classic period, as it's called, Hohokam region in the Phoenix area down south. We also have a lot in the Roosevelt Lake area, Tonto Basin, as is referred to. That's where they're really common in central Arizona. And essentially what this is a big pile of earth built up in a series of cells that will have structures on top of it. So it's not like a multi-storied structure, but it's like a platform with buildings on top of it. And some of those buildings can be multiple stories, but the platform itself is just fill. So it's often filled with dirt and fill. It will often have a compound wall around the outside of it. And this is a artist's reconstruction of what one of these may have looked like when this was in use. So interestingly, these are really, really common in the Tonto Basin, the Roosevelt area. They're absent in like the Verde Valley and everywhere else in central Arizona. We don't see these at all. They don't occur at all in this area. They occur down in the Phoenix area. So that's the other place where these are really common. This is an artist rendering of a site you may have heard called Pueblo Grande. It's recently had its name changed to Sudafvaki, which is just an Akimel name for the same site. And it just means the central religious structure, central religious building, and it's kind of central to the Phoenix area in general. But again, it's a giant platform with other buildings on top of it. And you have people living down below, some within the compound walls, some outside, but it's essentially like a big building with other buildings on top. So it's like you're separating certain activities from others. And there's been interpretations that people suggest this may have been a division between elites and non-elites in society and things like that occurring at that time. This was a relatively short-lived tradition everywhere in the Southwest, and sort of people eventually returned back to the small scattered villages that had been typical of the pre-classic period after about only 250 years. So this is a relatively short kind of interval. But we see this in the Tonto Basin, not further into central Arizona. Another thing, I talked a little bit about Chaco Canyon. This is Pueblo Bonito, which is an amazing site in Chaco Canyon. This huge stone structure has about 700 rooms. I don't know what I'm doing there. That's weird. That's someone else's mouse, I guess. Then we have the tall structure right there. And we've got I honestly don't know why that's happening. Someone else is controlling a pointer somehow. The computer's haunted. But we've got this tall structure back here that had a 5-story wall on the back there that kind of terraced down to 1 story in the front as well. And this structure essentially has these great kivas built into it. It has regular kivas, which are smaller versions of the same thing. Massive structures. It's made of very, very, very fine masonry. You can see the masonry is just very finely cut along the corners. You can see how tall I am here today, and I could essentially walk upright through these doorways. So these are big, overbuilt buildings. Just jumping ahead. And we don't see great houses in the classic sense in Central Arizona, but we see things that I think hint to connections at them. This is Wapatki. And essentially, Wapatki has very, very fine masonry compared to other sites in the area, right? This is something that's built in a different way. Other materials are available. In fact, if you go to Wapatki National Monument, we'll see other structures that are built from other kinds of stone that's not shaped in the same ways and things like this. But this is a shaped stone pueblo, multiple stories. It has that same kind of terraced stair-step pattern that you see at Pueblo Bonito and other great houses. It has a circular structure with a bench, which is similar in form to the Great Kivas, but it doesn't have a roof. And actually, unroofed Great Kivas are also common in other places like the Zuni area in the same time period in the 12th century and later in general. So that's not out of place. But one of the other things is it also has a ball court. There's both a ball court, a great house, and a great kiva all at the same site. That's talk about, you have a little bit of everything here in Central Arizona. But this big stone ball court here, you can see it's just right here. There's the Pueblo, there's that community room or great kiva, and here's the ball court, all in one place. So this is sort of just shows, here in Central Arizona, this is the Flagstaff area for those that have been. Essentially, we've got all these things kind of intersecting in this one place, and that's unique to this area. You don't see these same sort of things intersecting in the same place. So in addition to having all of those common public architectural forms that are associated with other parts of the Southwest, we also have ones that are specific to Central Arizona that really are specific to this area. And this, for example, there had been these linear features that were first identified by pilots. This was actually pilots were mentioning these to archaeologists first. That's where this kind of came from. They would see in the desert, there'd be these long, straight lines where essentially everybody had removed all the rock from some path, and they were just being called linear alignments. It's a great, really descriptive name there, right? Very, very exciting. You can see these are a couple of examples from the Perry Mesa area. There's examples in the Verde Valley. There's examples in the Polis Mesa area and in other areas to the east and things like that. And an archaeologist who was a grad student at Arizona State University, Will Russell, started studying these, and he started relating them to Pueblo racing. So contemporary Pueblo communities have racetracks, and races are commonly part of ceremonial events and things like that. And he was suggesting that these had a very similar form, size, and also associated features to the ones that we're seeing in contemporaneous Pueblo. So he was suggesting that these were actually racetracks. And this seems to be a tradition. These linear features are really common in Central Arizona, but we don't see them anywhere else, really. We see some maybe similar features later, but it's really the historic Pueblo racing is what we see. That's the closest analog to this in general. And these will often have, for example, these features have other things in common. So it will be a linear feature that usually goes out from a Pueblo structure like this. It goes out, and then at the other end, there'll be a plaza area. And in that plaza, you often find tools for grinding food, like manos and metates, and then roasting pits. So what's happening there is there's some party happening, some event happening that's happening in relation to the racetracks. This is one of the ones that's a little bit enigmatic. But it's showing that there's some creativity in the forms of public spaces that are happening in Central Arizona that's not really happening elsewhere as well. So let's talk about this again. Kind of regroup with this map. One of the things that we saw is that this area kind of had connections to all kinds of places. And if we think about it historically, the earliest connections seem to be tied to places like the Mogollon Mountains, and a little bit later in time, we start to see serial connections to other places in northern Arizona, western Arizona in general, tied to this portion of Central Arizona that's often referred to as the Sonoran region, especially later in time. And the definition of the Sonoran culture, even from the earliest days of 100 plus years ago when people were defining that, was always about that diversity. That diversity was part of what defined it, right? It was like the fact that they have all these different connections to diverse places in general. So what makes this area particularly keen on that? And one of the things I think is that this portion of Central Arizona is a place where just traffic between the north and the south would naturally be funneled, right? It's essentially like a funnel for foot traffic in so many ways. You can see all these settlements are largely along rivers, right here. And a lot of these rivers, if you look at the names of sites, there's sites like Chavez Pass, Largo Pass, Eagle Pass. There's all these sites that have the name Pass in them. Those are essentially sites that are located right at the passes and mountains where you have to cross, right? So this is, unlike many other parts of the Southwest, the dissected mountainous nature of this region means that like there's very few places which are the likely paths of travel between areas to the north and south and the west and the east in general. And those are going to be places that are going to essentially funnel all traffic into specific places in ways that you don't see, for example, in the Sonoran Desert, which is a more open environment where there's more options for where people could traverse and things like that in general. I'm not the first to notice these diverse connections. And this is Will Russell again, was a student at ASU that did a paper on Perry Mesa and showed just how at Perry Mesa specifically, there's connections to all these other parts of Arizona evident in the material culture that's found there. So, he was already suggesting, this is a really diverse connections. And he also, along with others, noted that, motifs that we see in Perry Mesa rock art, for example, are also some of the same symbols that are often used at places like Tatuvani, which is a place where Hopi people go and commemorate clan symbols and things like that, suggesting that, among the ancestors of people living in this area were the ancestors of people living in Hopi today, right? And the Hopi have specific clans that trace their histories to Central Arizona. They call these people Hisatsinam, right, for referring to this area in general. So I think this is sort of, one of these long-term connections that's sort of spelled out. We can see the evidence for the cultural claims in the material culture that we're seeing in the region as well. I talked about the mountain passes, direct travel in specific places. There's actually lots of evidence of historic trails. We have sort of documentation of early historic trails, and a lot of this documentation was made all the way back in the 16th century and 17th century by the first Spanish explorers. We're talking about what were the pathways along which people traveled in this areas. And there's a well-established pathway between Hopi and this area, for example, coming across this area down into central Arizona, into the Verde Valley, then south down to Phoenix. This was a way that people would travel that path. And it's no mistake that, a lot of the paths that we travel today via highway were originally these same pathways because they go through those mountain passes and things like that, right? It's like we're accounting for the topography and we end up in some of these same places. So another question we might ask is, what is it that people were getting out of the central Arizona region? We're seeing all this influence coming in. What's going the other way? And there's a few examples we might think of what is happening there. This is an area that has a lot of minerals. They're not available in other places, for example. So, the mining history of this area goes back to the ancient world as well. We've got things like argillite, azurite, all kinds of cupric, copper minerals. The turquoises and things like that are common in this area. Salt, there's huge salt mines in this area today. Salt was an extremely important resource in the past. And actually, in the colonial era, entire wagon trains were set up just for retrieving and distributing salt across the region. And one of the places that was the Verde Valley salt mines, for example. So there's these long distance connections for things like that. The other one is cotton. This is an area that probably had a relatively low population relative to the amount of food that could be grown here. So there was a lot of sort of excess agricultural labor that could be devoted to things like cotton, which grows well in this area, especially the native cotton as well. And actually, some of the finest textile woven garments that have ever been found in the Southwest come from this area, this part of the central Southwest in general. There's these kind of open weave things. This is something that's often referred to as the Tonto shirt from the Tonto Monument area. You can see this sort of open weave document. And this is a photo from the Dyke Dwelling Textile Collection at the Verde Valley Archaeological Center. There's some really amazing textiles that are there that are made in the sort of combination of solid and open weave style, loom-based textiles. And this really, people that specialize in the production of textiles and looking at the production of textiles often note that Central Arizona textiles are among the finest in the world. The way these are made, the sort of the styles of them and things like that. So that could be another thing that's flowing in the other direction. So far, I've mostly talked about the connections between Central Arizona and other places relatively nearby, right? On the order of 100, 150 miles away. What about even more distant connections? Again, if we look at major trails and major vectors of movement throughout all of North America, a lot of them intersect in this area for the same reasons. For example, La Paz and Mojave Trail, which were ancient trails, which were then the same trails that Fremont and Kit Carson and all these other people would later take to the west. A lot of them come through this area as well. And so, this is an example of just a remnant of the Butterfield stagecoach line. You can see that trail there that's left in the ground for just people traveling over the same path. We'll leave these wagon ruts and things like that are still visible to this day. This is the Kamatki Trail near Gila Bend, which is an ancient trail between areas in Gila Bend and sort of other portions of the region where there were rock art sites, for example, which are probably places of pilgrimage for people in the past. So these trails, we can look at ancient trail systems and map them and sort of help us understand what are the connections among these places that are even more distant from our location. In Central Arizona, for example, we have shell from all over the place here in Central Arizona. We have shell that shows up from the coast of California, species that are specific to the San Diego area or Central Coast that don't occur. Other places we have lots of shell coming from the Sea of Cortez down here, Rocky Point area in general. We've got shell that comes from even further south in places like Morelos and stuff like that, further south in Mexico in general. And one of the places, right here in Central Arizona, that's like where a lot of these paths meet. We have a lot of shell that's coming from these distant locations that ends up in these places as well. And for example, there's sites in the Flagstaff area where there's been shell from both the Pacific Ocean, the Sea of Cortez, and also like sand dollars and things like that are relatively rare in general. Shell is often used to make jewelry, etched items, and things like that across this entire region. Usually what we see in Central Arizona is we see finished products. We don't see evidence that people are making things here. We see the finished products here. So what we're seeing is the items already made. The production actually usually happens pretty close to the source. And that makes sense, right? If you're gonna carry something heavy, reduce it down to what it's gonna be before you carry it off and things like that in general. Copper bells. These are really, really impressive objects. Throughout the West Mexican area, there's a long history of people making and using copper metallurgy. At the time, they're often making these little rumbler bells, as they're often called, and many of these show up in the Southwest. They show up all over the Southwest. There's been examples here in Prescott. There's been examples nearby, never in the Verde Valley, surprisingly, although there's ones kind of to the north up near the Flagstaff area as well. But I think that could just be a product of we haven't excavated enough to find them yet. But this is a connection. These objects that are associated with West Mexico show up here in the Southwest, especially in Central Arizona through time. So that's another long distance connection. Macaws, parrots. So there's lots of macaws and parrots found throughout the Southwest. These are adult birds that were often, there's evidence that they weren't raised here, but they were brought here when they were young birds, essentially. So these are birds that were probably born deep south in Mexico and then come up, make their way up via other sorts of trade routes into this area. And this includes things like scarlet macaws, these beautiful scarlet macaws whose feathers have colors signifying, the 4 cardinal directions to southwestern people, for example. You can imagine how that would be a very important thing. And the earliest Spanish accounts of the Southwest talk about, all the parrots lined up on the roofs of pueblos as they encounter them and things like that in general. We've got military macaws, these green macaws that are also often found in this area as well. And thick-billed parrots, another bird that actually, their territory extends almost into Arizona. Those are also found there. But at Tuzigut, Montezuma as well, many sites in the Prescott area and many sites in the Verde Valley area. There's been examples, in Perry Mesa as well. There's been examples of burials involving parrots. They're often buried as if, given a proper burial and things like that as individuals. But they're usually adult fledgling birds that are usually about the age of 3 or 4 when buried in this area. But they were brought as live birds into this area. And this book is a great book if you're sort of interested in the history of this. And it's got a lot of, one of the things they talk to a lot of behavioral specialists that focus on birds. And one of the things they notice is that birds will bond with the person that raises them, essentially. And it's sort of hard to sort of transfer them to another person. So they're actually suggesting that the people that had parrots in the Southwest, were probably going and directly obtaining them. They're traveling to Mexico and then bringing them back. So that's a long distance to travel in this area. I put this one on there as a big question mark. There's been cacao or chocolate has been discovered all over the Southwest in recent years. People have developed methods for identifying it chemically, and then they started to look and started to find it all over the place. Whenever you have to have, the key is you have to have a collection of ceramics that were excavated and never washed. That's the thing you have to have, and that's the problem. We have all these things that are out on the museum shelves. They've already been washed with water. The remnants are gone. If you have unwashed collections, you can check for this. Kanishba in the White Mountains had evidence of chocolate. As far as I can tell, no one's ever checked in this part of central Arizona. And I put this up here because this is something that I hope someone does someday, because we have all these other things tying to Mesoamerica. I would be surprised if we don't also have evidence of the chocolate connection here as well too. And that's something that I think should be checked. We've got other connections to other parts of North America and other directions as well. So this is something called tiger chert biface. These are found at a small number of sites that all date to about the same time period. You can see them kind of along the Mogollon area in Arizona. The one on the right there was found near Bumblebee. People know where that is, a little bit south of Cordes Lakes down there. And I always think, this original article was published in black and white, which is kind of a shame because like the real chert is just like so beautiful. You can tell why they call it tiger chert, right? We've got this sort of diverse coloration scheme. That's an example of what that would look like in person. So that's a connection all the way from southwest Wyoming is the source of that material that's ending up in this area. So, in central Arizona, we've got shell from the Pacific coast, shell from the Sea of Cortez, shell from down further along the coast of Morelos. We've got copper bells coming from far south in Mexico. We've got macaws perhaps coming from the Gulf Coast of Mexico in this area. We also have obsidian from places like Nevada. We've got obsidian from Wyoming. We've got obsidian from locations within Arizona as well coming into this area. All these different things are making their way to central Arizona. And central Arizona has this diversity of materials that we really don't see elsewhere. It's a lot more diverse than, especially given that the population here was relatively low compared to other regions. It's actually kind of remarkable how much diversity and connections there were. And that's one of the things, is like, what is it like to live in a place like this? And I'm kind of arguing this was a crossroads between the north and the south and the east and the west. It's connecting all these different places. It's the kind of place where by nature of this environment, you're gonna have frequent interactions among people from diverse backgrounds, from diverse places. It's gonna be a point of contact between different areas. We're gonna have access to diverse materials, ideas, and environments. I talked about we've got the Sonoran Desert advantage and the Colorado Plateau advantage here. You can make use of resources in both directions. And it seems to be a place where we see a lot of creativity and innovation in social practices as well. A lot of practices that sort of spread to other parts of the Southwest have their origins in central Arizona. And one of the things that people have talked about in the Mogollon Mountains, for example, the Kachina religion that then sort of takes on in other parts of the Southwest has its origins in sort of the central Arizona to northern Arizona area as well too. We have the things like the racetracks and these new forms of features. We have reinterpretations of things like ball courts that occur in this area after they've given way in other regions through time. So this really does seem to be one of the things that, the hallmarks of what I would say of the archaeology of central Arizona is it's a consistently creative place where we're always seeing new things are occurring here first. It's sort of a place where a lot of things are developing first. And I think that's partly a product of just the fact that people were in contact with people from all over. They're constantly getting ideas and things like that coming from every direction. And I think that was a real advantage of this place. And one of the things that made this place unique in the past, and I think it's also one of the things that makes this place unique in the historic era as well too. All the mining activity, the trains, all these different things. This has always been a place where there's been like lots of different things happening, and people end up here for many different reasons. And I think that's kind of, one of the interesting strengths of this place in general. So I just want to say thank you for the invitation, Charlotte, Hull, and Bailey, for inviting me to do this. I also want to thank the ASU Legacies of the Landscape Project. I used a lot of photos for there, and my wife, Melissa Cruz Peeples, who's also an archaeologist, who took a lot of the photos that you saw here today as well. So thank you.